Hello, I'm Ali Murtaza, Head of Design at IDEATE Innovation, and this is Daftarkhwan Insights. So we're just going to talk about design in the law today. I'll introduce the series that we're doing. This is the second episode, and then we'll get into the discussion. And people who were here for the last one also would know that a lot of this should be very conversational. So beech mein I would want you guys to contribute, give your opinion, ask questions, whatever, and we can sort of flow from there. So I'm the head of design at IDEATE Innovation. We're a human-centered design firm. We do research, service design, UX design, and we've been operating for about 5.5 years now. We're officially based out of Islamabad, but we actually don't have an office at this point. We're all fully remote. So we have team members in Lahore, Islamabad, Karachi, and we're always hiring. So this series of talks is called Design in the World. And the idea is to sort of figure out or talk about things where design overlaps with other fields in the world that we might not otherwise think about as design related. For both ourselves as designers, where we sometimes I think tend to become too siloed into our own little worlds with Figma and all of these programs, trying to sort of have a wider perspective, but also have other people from different fields understand how their fields connect with design. So the first talk was on design and democracy. This one's on design and the law, and we'll do a couple more that we'll sort of release or the topics for in the coming weeks. So today's, as I mentioned, is design and the law. But why am I talking about this? I'm not a lawyer. I thankfully don't know much about the law either, and I would like to keep it that way. I also don't think I'm a design expert. The reason I think I can talk about this or give talks like this is because these are all stories that I've heard or read in places. It doesn't make me any more of an expert on the stories themselves. I've just sort of picked topics that I wanted to research about, looked up stories, read about them over time, and then collected them into some sort of presentations that I can give out. So essentially, this is more or less me telling stories from around the world that I would like you guys to engage in as well. So in design and the law, what do you guys think? How would these two overlap? Can you think of a connection where the design world and laws in some way overlap or influence each other? Any ideas? There's one idea right here, which is wheelchair ramps and access in building code that's often built in. Not enough in Pakistan, but it's at least people know about this sort of influence of the law on design. Anything else?
Cars and their safeties?
Yeah, safety regulations for cars. They need to pass a lot of safety tests. Anything else?
Public policy?
Sure, yeah, public policy. As we already see, there's a lot of different areas or industries that we can see the overlap between design and the law. And then there's more obvious options like, again, as I mentioned, accessibility for buildings, including wheelchair ramps and such. And stuff like elevator doors have a minimum, generally have a minimum width that you can have as a starting point for design. So if you were asked to design an elevator door, you're going to start off with some parameters which some court case at some point decided for you. So you don't need to be aware of that case, obviously, but that case has sort of formed your design brief for you, where you can start off with. But we'll talk about some other stories, like why this girl is crying. And that's the sort of story we'll cover in today's talk. And I'll also tell you why it's probably these guys' fault. They're generic lawyers' stock image. And so a lot of these stories will be just stories, essentially. This is a storytelling exercise around things like these. This is how, does anyone know what industrial looms are? Like, kya hota tha? When were these used? Any ideas? So these were around 16th, 17th century. They were very, very prevalent. They were the main way that fabric was created. So loom ke upar. And these kids that used to work on these alongside a master weaver as well as a designer, their job was, the reason why kids would do a job called, and they were literally called draw boys, was that you had to pick threads जो ऊपर आनी है, जो नीचे जानी है. So you need essentially very small fingers to be able to weave those threads on the loom. That's why the job was essentially a child labor job at that point. And still, unfortunately, similar practices happen in industries around the world where similar requirements are similar things are needed. Also, talking of draw boys, I don't know if anyone gets this reference, but on those industrial looms, you had stuff like this being made for royals. So these are two very handsomely dressed young men, or not so young men, from the 16th and 17th centuries. And this is the sort of fabric that they would get created for themselves, sort of height of luxury at that point. And you can imagine how many hours of labor goes into making fabric like this. So the more fabric you have, the more higher you are probably in the social standing. Eventually, around the 17th century, more textile starts getting imported into Europe from places like China. And it turns out that they have much more complex embroidery going on. So that becomes the status symbol. So you go from just more fabric to being like, okay, so the more intricate the patterns, the more work it takes, so probably higher in the social standing. But it also then influences fashion in Europe. And this is an example from China. Dresses like these that are being worn, and that sort of this influences a lot of the fashion there, with patterns becoming a much bigger part of the social standing and its connection with fashion. And then this guy comes along. So he creates something called the Jacquard Loom, which becomes one of the first ways of automating the creation of fabric and patterns. And his name's Joseph Marie Jacquard, and this is the Jacquard Loom. And one of the main things that he does is he automates the job that those draw boys had, which was about picking the right thread that goes over. So he figures out a way where you can automate a lot of that through something called punch cards. Has everyone heard of what punch cards are? Okay, so punch cards are something that were created for the Jacquard Loom. They essentially, I'll show you what they look like, the ones on the left. So what you could then do is you could design your pattern and make these cards for those. Wherever the holes are is where the fabric the hook can reach and get one thread out. So you're essentially automating the job that was done manually for the longest time. And what happens with this is that now the job of creating the fabric is less important, but the job of creating the design becomes more important. So this can be considered one of the first places where the thing that's valued more is the design rather than the labor that goes into creating things. And also, another thing that happens as a result is that people start stealing people's designs. So intellectual property theft kind of starts, where everyone can now create the thing because you can buy the machine, but you're being judged for how cool your patterns are. And if you don't have a great designer, you steal somebody else's design. So these punch cards start getting elevated in value. So you can think of them as like original source files that people are now stealing, and might be one of the first examples of that kind of intellectual property theft. On that note, can you guys recognize that interface? How many here know what that is? I think there's a great age divide here. I love it. Yeah, so that's LimeWire before Spotify's and Apple Music's and all of those. We downloaded music through piracy, and I think you can think of punch cards as being one of the first forms of piracy for in that era. You're essentially stealing somebody's design. You can replicate it, make copies, distribute them. Then Herman Hollerith, a guy in the late 19th century, uses that Jacquard loom design from around 80 years ago to then automate the tabulation of the US census of 1890. And before this, every time they would have a census, which was 10 years apart, it took about 10 years just to count the numbers. So by the time you knew how many people lived in the US, you had a new census that had to happen. And through his automation, they managed to do this in about 3 years. And what he did was the automation worked in a way where when taking the census, when taking information, they used punch cards. So once you have the data on punch cards, you can automate its reading through similar Jacquard loom type processes. So the thing that was created to make fabric then kind of becomes computation machine in the same century. He then also patents his design, and this is one of the drawings from that the patent he filed, I think, in 1890. And a bunch of these patents come together over the next few decades around the same technology, tabulation and Jacquard loom, and create a company that you might know of called IBM. And that sort of IBM's foundation is in the patents that were filed for the initial tabulation machines. So we go from fashion in China to IBM to iPhones, which we use to order clothes from China. So full circle. To talking of the Jacquard Loom again, back to slightly before iPhones were a thing. Once Jacquard Looms became more common, people's clothes started becoming slightly different. Again, if you can produce different things, your fashion over time changes. And these are the sort of clothes around that era. Things like laces and really intricate patterns start becoming much more common because they're easier to produce. So you can imagine how that sort of changes the visual language of the age. Also, kids are usually just given mini-me versions of whatever the parents wear. So little girls are essentially wearing the same dress, they're just smaller. Which also applies obviously to the working class, where if the dad's working in the factory, the son also wears essentially a smaller version of the same stuff that the dad wears. So just imagining how we might think of children's fashion as being a different category wasn't really a thing at that point. And this is what, again, working class kids might wear working in factories at that point. But this is also around the time, this is again not a phenomena that happens in one place, but over time, a lot of the philosophies around sort of treating childhood as a different thing to value and a very distinct phase of life start becoming more accepted around the world. And one of the things that happens there is that kids start getting their own fashion. So it's like thinking of childhood as being a different thing rather than just a small adult. And then you're like, Achha, what should we dress them as? And then you have different ideas of what that fashion could look like. People started thinking about like or started seeing how this might affect different things, or what effects this might have, because this is now new kinds of fashion, it's made for kids. And there's things like fire hazards that start becoming more of a thing related to what clothes can look like, what they should look like, and so on. And you can imagine there are candles around, kids are running around wearing these dresses, that might be a problem. So you also can imagine like with fire hazards, potentially also clothes that are, I don't know what the word would be. I was thinking fluffy, but that's probably not a good word. Flared, with kids running around a house might get caught in places leading to accidents. Over time, that does happen, and a lot of lawsuits happen. Clearly a real picture from the 17th century, 18th century, where there's a lot of incidents where the clothes that the kid was wearing get blamed for the accidents that the kid was in. And that sort of over time leads us to a place where kids' clothes have very, very strict guidelines for what you can and can't make. Has anyone here noticed or heard or actually experienced wearing kids being very, very uncomfortable and saying, but kapde chubh rahe hain, and they're like prickly and all of those things, right? Oftentimes they're also meant to be uncomfortable. Any idea why that might be? So they're designed to be uncomfortable.
So the fashion change, the style of that was.
So the main reason for this is that there's one of the things that has the most regulations in clothing overall, but also specifically in children's clothes, is around what can count as sleepwear. So anything that sleepwear is a separate category, and anything that can count as sleepwear needs to be fire retardant. It needs to be pretty much skin tight. It needs to have very specific materials. So anything else that you're making that isn't meant to be sleepwear needs to be so uncomfortable that a kid can't sleep in it. So that even if they sleep in it and there's a problem at some point, some accident happens, you as a company can claim that this was meant to not be slept in, so this is not our fault. That's literally why any party clothes for kids, anything of that sort, will pretty much always be uncomfortable because the designer doesn't want them to sleep in them. That's so law essentially dictating what we can and can't do with design. And that's why this kid is crying. And that's why it's their fault. We want to be very user-centered, but we also understand there are things like laws that we can't get around to. And also, those laws, in a way, are also part of the larger human-centered principle. So if there are actual reasons for why, for instance, choking hazards can happen. An example of this is kids' clothes. For any hoodies that you might see, hoodies mein wo drawstrings hoti na that you can. So kids' hoodies can't have drawstrings that actually work. So they will have drawstrings kabhi, but they will just be aesthetic. Part of that is also because that those could get caught up somewhere and the kid could actually be strangled. So these are all, so part of that, it's a balance, but you can also see why those rules would exist. But yeah, it's their fault, is what I'm saying. Does anyone know where this is from? A park. Great answer. And this? The first one I just took off the internet. I don't know where it's from. This one's in some park in Murray. This one? From freepick.com. I have no idea where they're from. But the idea here was that these are 3 randomly taken pictures. One I took, 2 other random park pictures. But I'm sure they look like parks that you've seen in different places. Right? Has anyone seen playgrounds, children's playgrounds around outside Pakistan anywhere? Do they also look similar? Yeah, yeses and some no's. Okay. So one of the things you'll see around the world is that they pretty much always look like a variation of the same thing. There'll be some slides, there'll be some monkey bars. They might be the swings might have these tires, or they might have a plank, but they're essentially just swings. So there's a lot of uniformity around parks for kids or playgrounds for kids, pretty much around the world. And we'll talk about why that happens. Before that, we'll start here. Has anyone seen a coffee table like that before? Maybe in a movie where somewhere, okay, a bunch of you have. So this table was designed by Isamu Naguchi, and the table is called the Naguchi coffee table. He was a Japanese-American sculptor, artist, and had a very tough childhood. Was born in the US, then moved back to Japan. His dad abandoned the family. He lived a fairly tough life growing up in a place where he could see Mount Fuji sort of every morning. So he was kind of the sort of kid who would just try to daydream his way through his problems. And one of the things he always imagined was that more of the world should be designed for kids' imaginations. So adults shouldn't be telling their kids or any kids how to play, for instance. If you leave kids to do whatever they want, they'll figure out ways to play and they'll learn much more. So that was his sort of guiding principle. So one of the things he did was he also thought that the sculptures he made should take the form of playgrounds for children. So because they're abstract forms, you just give those forms to children and just let them figure out what they want to do with it. And he had some really weird abstract park. These are all playground designs that he created. And the idea is sort of I forget the exact term, but just let the kid figure out what they want to do with the space, and don't have too many guiding sort of principles that guide their play. While during his life, most of his plans got rejected. He also had very ambitious plans. So he took a plan for his biggest thing that he wanted to create throughout his life was the Play Mountain, which was inspired by Mount Fuji. So he wanted to create this giant pyramid-type mountain as a playground for kids. And he proposed, I think, 3 different occasions to New York City to build a play mountain on a whole block of New York City. And if anyone's been to New York, they know how big blocks are and how expensive they are. And that was just an idea he kept pushing. So very ambitious. Wanted these things to be really large, and essentially so that more of the world could be a playground for children. Even though he couldn't build his dream to that level, during his life, a lot of other architects and urban designers got influenced by those ideas. And these are some of the playgrounds that were created in the 60s and 70s through his influence on this kind of play. Unfortunately, also, these playgrounds existed which look similar to ours. And in a very sad incident in 1982, I believe, a kid in Chicago fell from a 12-foot tall slide and got paralyzed for life, also sustained permanent brain damage. The family sued the city of Chicago, and the parks department had to pay $9.5 million. You can imagine how that would have then upped the ante on figuring out safety around playgrounds. And then we get here. About a couple of decades later, every playground in the US then gets very strict regulations. There are safety authorities that need to check literally the circumference of the bars that are placed based on like how a kid can grip on these. If somebody hits their head on this one thing, how do you make that damage the least possible? So over time, through these regulations, you develop such a strict sort of parameters for what a playground can look like that most playgrounds end up looking the same. You can still create custom playgrounds which look very different, but you can imagine that's much more expensive. Because if you just want to order a slide, there's a million slides being created. They just ship the slides all over the world. Naguchi's ideas around Play Mountain and his playgrounds do get created in Japan. He signs off on them when he was still alive. They finally get created about 17 years after he dies, over a 400 and something acre place. So gigantic. It's like about it's size of 4 Disneylands essentially. Which is his playground. All of his designs essentially get created in one place in Japan, and this is an aerial view of some of those areas. And this is a picture from 2004, I think. Just you can see there's less guidance on what to do with this. Whereas if there's a swing, you can the swing is guiding the kid on how to play, whereas this is something more abstract, you just figure out what you want to do with it. So, and you can also see that these kind of look like sculptures. They just happen to be slightly bigger and happen to be in an environment where kids can play. I really like these forms. Also, this giant play mountain finally gets made, a version of it. He made a few different versions, and you can see the scale of it again. And the idea is just like kids do whatever they want, give them a slope, give them some stairs, have some swings on the other side or other sculptures, and they'll just figure out the way they want to play. I would have probably tried rolling down there and gotten my 5th nose injury. Speaking of, has anyone seen this movie? Do you know what this is from? Rush Hour 2, yes. There's also a lot of money around here. Any estimates how much money that might be? $1 billion. How do you think like these movie sets can just have this money lying around, spread around on a movie set? It's fake money. Simple enough answer. But also, on the set of this movie, the FBI visits on one of the days that they were shooting these scenes, and they had brought a charge of counterfeiting on the director. Any ideas why that might be? The fake money looked too real. So you need fake money, which looks real enough for us to be fooled on screen, right? But it can't be real enough that somebody could use it as fake money. Right, it was too good at doing a fake money job. So that's and again, the laws around this are very, very tight, and we'll talk about how those came to be. But essentially, they had a charge. They eventually had to stop using that money, ordered completely new fake money, and reshoot a bunch of scenes because you can't have money that looks that nice. They had to sell $1 billion of fake money, or actually burn $1 billion of fake money, and also all the other footage that they shot with the fake money, because now it wasn't legal fake money. Why this happened was that the US had a lot of problems with fake money in the 1840s, 50s. In around 1860, laws get passed around which stop anyone from copying or even taking a picture of dollars in a way that they could be sort of replicated. Around the 1920s, movies are taking off, and at that point, they just decided to use real money from Mexico. After the Mexican Revolution, a lot of the regional money that was created basically became useless. So the US film production houses bought a bunch of defunct Mexican money and started using as that in the movies. So there was no expectation from viewers for the money to look like dollars. That was just assumed that whatever currency looking thing is just dollars, right? What happens interestingly over time is now you have like, let's say, whatever amount of fake money or Mexican money that was brought in had no value. Suddenly there's a lot of demand for it. What happens to the money? The defunct money now gets expensive because more and more people want the same defunct money because that's the thing that people want to see on screen, right? Slightly fast forwarding. R.J. Repapo is one of the, he owns a company which now pretty much makes all the fake money for Hollywood. And I'll talk about how that came to be. But he also makes a lot of other props, or his company makes a lot of other props. This is a fake airplane cockpit. These are fake movie cameras. So their whole company just does movie props. And they pretty much have a monopoly on fake US dollars, which you can see here. Does anyone know where this scene is from? Huh? Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad. So similar. Yeah. Breaking Bad, pile of money, they lie down on top of it. Great scene. I think he goes, I have to do it. And they're like, do what? And then he falls on the money. But yeah, so these are all fake dollars from the R.J. Repapo company. Also, probably a more recognizable image of the same. All fake money from the same company. Pretty much any rapper video you'll ever see, any music video you'll ever see with piles of cash will be fake money. Their website is actually really great. I'll send a link. You can get duffel bags of money on rent. So you can have like a duffel bag full of like $100 notes for like $65 a week. So you just pretend to be really rich for a week, give the money back, but you have to pay for like $200 of insurance just in case you don't return it. But it's a whole business where you just get fake money. The reason why they pretty much have a monopoly at this point is because they spent 3 years working with the Secret Service to make the money real enough that it was passable, but not real enough that they would have a court case on them. So that 3 years of iteration on the money just made, they have the design now locked for the perfect fake money, which nobody else can copy, and it's not worth for anyone else to go through a 3-year cycle with the Secret Service to make fake money. But yeah, they've kind of nailed fake money. Talking of money, does anyone know what this place is? New York, Central Park, yes. Any idea what this part of New York is? Billionaires Row, yes. So this part is literally just called Billionaires Row, not surprising why it might be called that. There's some really interesting design things that happen here, but also very, very interesting social reasons why this thing exists. But these have some of the tallest buildings, as you can see, in New York. And one thing you might notice about these is that all these towers are very, very thin. They're skyscrapers, but also ridiculously thin, almost like fake-looking skyscrapers. Okay, imagine that this building in the middle, this is the tallest this building is allowed to be. So every building, you can imagine, if I buy a lot of land, there might be some maximum height that I can build on top, right? If I buy like a square foot of land, there's probably going to be some law around how tall I can build that on that small land. So those laws exist. But then there's also, so imagine like this lot that this building is on, this is the highest amount it can, highest it can go into with the regulations. But then they only build the building this tall. So they have some room to build taller, but they just choose not to. So let's say these are 10 stories, they could have built 20 stories, but they've decided we just keep to 10. Now they have this space on top, which they have the right to build on, but they have decided not to. So the laws in the US allow you to sell that airspace. So you can sell that space of non-existent construction site over your building to somebody else who doesn't have more space to build up, right? So everyone gets their own share. Think of Lego blocks. I get 5 Lego blocks, you get 5 Lego blocks. I can't get more than 5 until I buy 4 from you. Your building's just 1 Lego block tall. I make a 9 Lego block tall building. And that's how stuff like this happens. That building sells some of its air rights to that building gets taller. And over time, if you want to build a really tall skyscraper, you start off with a small plot of land, and then you build whatever you can build, and then buy airspace from everyone else. One other advantage of this for these people is that when I build a skyscraper and I want to sell my penthouse for $100 million, I don't want somebody else to build a building as tall as that on the side to stop the view, right? If you've bought the airspace from all the buildings around you, nobody else can build a taller building. So you'll always maintain your views from the top of the higher floors, and you get either monstrosities or amazing pieces of architecture of this sort. One of the thinnest skyscrapers in the world. You can see it's a bit weird looking. I think very almost like a generic SimCity kind of tower. But also you get views like these from the penthouse, which is why they can sell for a lot of money. And again, imagine now they can promise that your view will never be blocked from at least a certain radius, because they know nobody else can build a building taller or as tall as this in the vicinity. And you can kind of look down on the Empire State Building. That's a weird flex. And this is the thinnest skyscraper in New York, 101 West 57th, I think. So one of the things that, just talking about status symbols and money, one of the reasons why one of the ways that these have become a status symbol is that people will just say the number. So they'll say, oh, I live in 111 or 157. So you don't say the street, you don't say the area. Everyone knows 111 is this building, or 347 is one building. So that's just like part of why the culture of this sort of big money investments happens around these. But yeah, this is the thinnest one of the lot. And these things do come up with, obviously, a lot of design challenges. When you want to build a building that's just ridiculously tall on the same lot, you will face challenges that other buildings won't. So stuff like 2 floors in this building, every 20 floors or so, I think, after some height, are essentially blank. Just for air to be able to pass through, because otherwise that might be a problem. They already sway quite a lot in windy conditions. This is a way to sort of counter that. Almost like वो देखे banners के अंदर लोग सुराख कर देते हैं. It's sort of that rich person version of that, but essentially doing the same job. But you get views like this from the penthouse on top of that building, and it's priced at $169 million. If anyone has change lying around, you can get these views. Or 17.78 Chicago Park lawsuits in other terms. And you get, sorry? Yes, exactly. So you get these views, and you also get a lot of great food as part of that package. There's only one problem with this view, that it's fake. Alongside this food, this doesn't exist either. Has anyone heard of Midjourney? Yes. So I created these in Midjourney. It's just like, yeah, so this doesn't exist. We'll move to why I'm transitioning to this phase. This is the actual view, not bad either, but I just had a fake view in its place, which clearly looked real enough. And this was the thing I created on Midjourney, which I was using as the fake view from New York. And this is the prompt I used, if you want to read it, if anyone wants to make their own versions of this. Right, so this is the prompt I gave Midjourney. Midjourney produced this thing for me. So who made this image? An algorithm, AI? Lawyers. that girl. Other images made them, sure. So maybe the creators of other images, would that work? So the AI, the creator of the AI, the images that were used to create, to train the AI, the creators of those images, all of them could potentially get credit. I'm not getting credit. It's the thing we've learned. But anyhow, so I think it's an interesting problem. Like I was even saying I created this image, and nobody really questioned me until we had this discussion about like who really created it, and then it's like, oh, actually you didn't create it. But also if I didn't give the prompt, it wouldn't create it. So there's some weird collaboration happening. Again, I don't take credit for it, but there's some version of it where there's a collaboration. So who made this image that I showed you earlier? Because this is the image I found, but somebody else took, and I changed it to change the size of the buildings. Who made this image? Me and Photoshop, yes. Anything else? The person who took the original? The person who took the original image, maybe? So so if I'm using Photoshop, I feel like now most people, if I created like a composite image in Photoshop, most people would be fine with me giving myself credit for it. But I do think that maybe 20 years ago, that was less the case, where people would also, especially if I used anything where AI in any way was helping me create that image, merging things, all of that, people would be less likely to give me credit for it because they were like, yeah, real art nahi hai. Because I still remember like when I was sort of graduating from undergrad, around that time, I think for the first time, people were starting to see digital art in Pakistan. And a lot of people would say, this is not art. Like this is something else. This is not quite the same thing that we do on canvases, right? But over time, I think most people have accepted that that's art and the creators are creating the thing. But while creating it, I've done digital art where I've used a lot of smart tools that Photoshop has, Illustrator has. Illustrator has a bunch of things where you draw 2 lines, it draws 10 lines in the middle, right? I've not drawn those lines, but somehow most people here would be fine with me claiming that I've created that whole image with the assistance of tools. So I think one of the interesting things that will happen down the line is where we place the credit for these things, and that will obviously have a huge implication on like intellectual property rights and all of those kind of cases. So who owns this image? If I took the picture or somebody else took the picture, I edited it, made a version, and they were okay with me editing it. Who owns it now? In Midjourney's licenses, the one I have ownership of it, but also Midjourney can use it. So technically, both of us own this image pretty much as any other image that is created. Also, if you don't buy the Midjourney license, then only Midjourney has license to use your images. So they can still use your artwork, but you can't. So there's an interesting overlap there that's happening. Should I be allowed to do this? Just create images with text prompts? I literally just said Adidas sneaker and Nike sneaker. No more effort needed. And these kind of look like Adidas and Nike sneakers. Does anyone notice anything weird about the Adidas sneaker though? There are 4 stripes. So it doesn't get everything right. So this won a digital art competition a little while ago, and it was created in Midjourney. But the artist had the license to use the image, and other people are also using digital tools that they haven't created. Some other programmers have created those tools. So what did the artist do wrong? Like, and why shouldn't they be able to win a digital art award. So they didn't do anything wrong, but all of us, I think, would understand if we lost to this, we'd be slightly pissed off if we've spent all our lives figuring out color theory and all of those things, and then this wins. But I don't know whether I would be able to say that this is wrong. It's probably a different category. But again, I can imagine now Photoshop has a bunch of AI tools where it just fills space for you. You can choose one color, it makes 10 variations. Where's the line of like where AI is assisting me too much? And if I get really good at working with AI, is that my fault? I did a bunch of drawings. This is from like grad school a long time ago. These are all drawings I was working on designing a watch. These are all done by hand. I'm sure I'll get credit for these. But then I also used some 3D rendering softwares or 3D design softwares to make a 3D model. Then I pressed a button called render, and it gave me an image that I never really created, right? Like I created a 3D model based on my drawings, but then the final image, I don't really know how the rendering engine works to give me that final image. But I'm very happy to claim credit for this. Should I get credit for this? Sorry? I can explain, but so I sketched something out, I made a 3D model, then I pressed render, and it gave me this really nice looking image. Did I create this image? Slightly more confusing. So the way this watch worked was essentially trying to show 24 time zones on one mechanical watch. So each of these, so it's like, let's say 3:30 a.m. in Dakar and 3:30 p.m. There's no time zone there. 5:30 a.m. in Paris, 5:30 p.m. in Honolulu. And each of these goes here, and there's also a daylight saving time thing that was incorporated. And eventually, this is another variation of it. So there's a belt there for minutes. There's two belts for AM and PM on both sides, so you can technically see all that time. But again, I did not create these final images. Some rendering engine did. And we've also kind of had this discussion about why these are different. Some people, I think, instinctively, I feel like they are different. But I don't really know exactly why. Like when I really get into like, मैंने क्या किया, AI ने क्या किया, I'm not really sure. Sorry.
Journey, you used words to create an image, but here you actually put in an effort to design it, like make art, and then it was rendered. So maybe there are two different mediums were used to create those two images. So you can also categorize them in that way.
Right.
That not like art, like there are different types of art.
Right. So if I, for instance, I think I showed you those food images, right? That if I had first created food that looked like that, and then I created a prompt to match the food that I created, would that be similar to this?
But
I don't have the answer, by the way, to any of this. I'm just asking.
Maybe it would be similar if the images that were used to create the Midjourney image were taken by you.
Oh, interesting.
Like you sketched the watch, right? And then the engine rendered it. So if you took the images and provided those images as well, and then the prompt that created the final image, then I guess you get it.
Right. So essentially the source image is where the production starts, right? So I can get credit for it if I did the source image. Talking of time, I'm out of it. Thank you.